All right, thank you, Bianca. That was really great. Next up, we'll be hearing from Audrey Maran, a Knauss Fellow as well, working as a science communication specialist in the National Sea Grant Office. Audrey is a biological sciences PhD candidate at Bowling Green State University. Her research has centered around insect ecology in a human-impacted world. Her specific research topics have included insects and carbon cycling under climate change, insects and nutrient cycling in an agricultural soil, and insect interactions in urban prairies. Before pursuing her master's degree and now PhD, Audrey received her undergraduate degree in high school life and earth science education from Bowling Green State University. During her undergraduate senior year, she was asked to volunteer in a professor's lab where she fell in love with the process of science, aquatic insects, and the terrestrial-aquatic interface. Today she will be presenting Let Me Put a Bug in Your Ear, What NOAA Should Know About Insects.
So thank you, Hollis, for that lovely introduction. So really today my goal is truly just to put a bug in your ear. I just want to get people thinking about insects and how those insects can influence the work that NOAA does and how what NOAA does can influence the way that we think about insects. So first, to tell you a little bit more about why I'm here talking to you about insects today, I'll give you a little bit of background on what I've done. So as Hollis said, I studied how when humans are modifying habitats, how does that affect insect-mediated ecosystem services? And that's really just a fancy way of saying that insects do all these great things for us. They pollinate, they disperse seeds, they cycle nutrients, they're really good predators, and more. So how does the fact that we are building cities and we have all these agricultural fields affect those insects and the services that they're providing to us? So my the first part of my PhD focused on agricultural fields and insects' role in agricultural fields, but more specifically the insects on the ground. So we often think about herbivores when we think about ag fields, but there are also these insects that live in the soil and they're cycling the nutrients. I will talk a little bit more about this later in the talk, so I'm going to keep going for the moment, but just kind of a sneak preview of the type of ways that insects can help with soil nutrients. The other work I did took place in urban prairies, and I love to use this picture because these prairies that I worked in some of them were at a zoo, and a lot of times when I walk around with my bug vacuum, kids would be like, Ghostbuster. So I took this picture one day after a kid called me a Ghostbuster because it just made me so happy. But anyway, so I'm at these prairies, and I was looking specifically at how complexity in the prairies impacts the way that predator insects function in those prairies. So when you think about complexity, I have these two examples of a playground. The top playground is really complex. And if you were playing a game of tag or hide and go seek or something like that, it would go on a lot longer in that top prairie than it would in the bottom prairie. So basically predators are better able to kind of lead to a stable predator-prey cycle and having plenty of resources and take in the prey rather than just eating everything, going away, and then the prey booming and taking over. So I was curious about the complexity in the prairie, but also the complexity around the prairie. So by complexity in a prairie, like in a playground, we have all these different types of play areas. There's a lot of them, kind of a similar thing in vegetation. There's a lot of vegetation, many leaves, lots of different types of flowers and things. So that is the work that I did, and that is the lens that I'm coming through. So a lot of people have asked me why I'm interested in NOAA. I come from this insect background, and I hope today that I can show you why. I'm going to tell you a few stories, and through those stories, I hope that I can convince you of that. So to start out, how many of you like to eat salmon? That's what I thought. Maybe even stopped by the Sea Grant booth at the fish fry and ate some of our salmon. So I want you to look into this fly's eyes, and I want you to thank it for that salmon. And I'll explain why that would be. And this is a robber fly, by the way. Gorgeous flies, really good predators. So terrestrial invertebrates are actually quite a large source of food for fish, certain types of fish especially. So salmon is one of those. When they're in rivers, when you have these forested areas, terrestrial invertebrates fall in, and they make up a large part of these fish's diets in some cases. So there are numbers documented anywhere from 30%, 50%, 85%. The numbers vary greatly, and it varies by season and where you're sampling. But either way, terrestrial invertebrates have a large impact on salmon's food source and other fish. So I want to tell you about a study that Dr. Nakano did. If you've not heard about him before, what he did is he was very interested in terrestrial inputs to streams. And one day he's shopping for greenhouses with one of his graduate students, I believe, and he realizes this thing could fit smack over this stream. And so he does that. He buys a greenhouse, he puts it over the stream, puts some netting on there, and now no longer can the terrestrial invertebrates fall into the stream. And the results that he found have been groundbreaking, and a lot of people have thought about these results as they continue to do research. So when insects are falling into streams, you have the fish eating them, they're happy. When you eliminate those insects, they start feeding from the bottom. So they're able, and I think in this case, I'm pretty sure the fish was Dollyvarden. So the Dollyvarden were able to feed off the bottom of the stream and take up the benthic invertebrates. And those are doing things like eating algae, and eating detritus or the dead stuff that's in the stream. And when you eliminate them, they eat 33% of the lower 33% of the benthic invertebrates and increase the algal biomass by 60% in that stream. So just having these terrestrial invertebrates or insects falling into the water has a massive influence on what these fish are eating and how that cascades throughout the ecosystem. So I'm going to continue telling you stories kind of along these lines. We've already talked a little bit about fish. I'm also going to tell you less, but some about how what NOAA does impacts the way that we think about insects. So with fish, I've already talked about how the absence of terrestrial insects as food can have cascading effects on water quality. But there's more to this as well. So when we think about fisheries in NOAA, think about sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, restoring habitats. And fish are eating these insects. So when you're thinking about restoring a habitat or protecting a species, you also have to think sometimes about what's outside of the water. So how are you preserving those areas that some of their food sources are actually going to be coming from? In some cases, 80% of their food source may be coming from. So that's just an important thing to consider when we're thinking about habitat restoration. And with aquaculture, some of the food source is, some of the newer food sources are insect-based. Oh no. I will allow it. I put it there. I recognize you. So what this is going to show you is just kind of a fun example of how this goes both ways. Ow. Come on, you can do it. Maybe I can't get the mouse to jump down there. Let me see if you're any better. Yep.
They're in the shallows.
This is a fishing spider, by the way.
The fishing spider injects paralyzing venom into the fish, which slowly turns its insides into a nutritious soup.
Love how dramatic
This
it is.
prize catch is something worth bragging about.
Yes, we do have fishing spiders around here. Okay, so that's just a fun way of looking at, yes, it does go both ways. Sometimes the insects or the other arthropods are eating fish too. So the point I was trying to make with this is that terrestrial insects feed fish and are an important consideration for restoration and conservation efforts. Okay, moving on to coasts. And I'm not focusing as much on the oceans, just more the coastal side of this. So coastal resilience is of great concern to NOAA, making sure that people can deal with increased flooding events, increased hazards that cause flooding, such as hurricanes, sea level rise. So I want to back up for 1 second and think about the dirt before the flood comes in. So this soil I've tried to show here might have a lot of mosquito eggs in it, because mosquitoes, some of them are very crafty, and they will put their eggs in the soil, and then those mosquito eggs just sit there waiting for a good drink of water. And as soon as that water comes in, they are very happy to turn into larvae and lay their pupae and then come out of the water and bite you. At first, it's not a big deal. It's nuisance mosquitoes. They're a pain, but during cleanup efforts, it's just more of a pain, more of a nuisance. But 2 weeks to 2 months later, you start to get disease-spreading mosquitoes that will come in, because the adults have been killed by the hurricane. But now at this point, they can come in, come to the water, lay their eggs, and now while people are outside cleaning up, you have this extra problem of disease-spreading mosquitoes. So I think it's important to think about how the threat of disease transferring mosquitoes could impact coastal resilience and our efforts to make sure that people are resilient at the coast. There's also algal blooms. So this is a bit closer to the work that I've done and a bit closer to me personally. So I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, so I am very familiar with algal blooms and the impacts that algal blooms can have. And the fact that nutrients, excess nutrients, are what's causing these algal blooms and even the toxins they produce. So what do insects have to do with nutrients and algal blooms? Well, many insects, including this gorgeous millipede that you may see on the trails. That's okay, it moves, it doesn't need to move, it's just cool legs. So this millipede that you might see on trails around here quite frequently, it probably likes to eat dead leaves, lots of other dead detritus that you find on the ground, so all of the dead things, as well as worms, beetles, and a lot of other bugs do this too. And when they're doing that, they're taking leaves and they're breaking them into pieces. And those pieces are really useful to microbes that live in the soil, because it gives them a lot more surface area to live on and then break the leaf down. So the bacteria are really the big guns when it comes to decomposition. And through decomposition, they're putting things like nitrogen and phosphorus back into the soil that can then be used by the plants. So insects actually play a pretty large role in this, especially in some ecosystems, by breaking up the bigger things. So the first part of my dissertation focused on this idea, and I took dead mayflies because they're a nuisance in the area where I live. So we had all these kind of nuisance labile, which means very easy to break down nutrients, put them on the ground and see if we can draw in the insects that are really important. Because right now, if you look at that field, there is nothing for them to eat. So they're not going to be there, because why would they go there? There's no habitat, there's no food. But if we can bring them in, will they play a role in cycling nutrients in the soil and helping the plants to flourish? So my results suggested that yes, they will come, but you've got to keep them there if you want anything to happen. So I'm not suggesting this is a cure-all for algal blooms, definitely not. But it's important to think about how the nutrients in the soil impact what eventually gets into the water. So insects and other arthropods cycle nutrients in the soil, ultimately impacting the amount of nutrients that enter soil runoff. So now focusing on climate, which is a big one with insects in a couple of ways. So first of all, those same insects that are breaking down leaves and moving around in the soil, as I said, they make room for microbes to come in. And they also do other things, like they might selectively graze on different types of microbes, so certain types of fungi. And that has a large role on the amount of CO2 that comes out of the soil. In fact, it can be very impactful depending on microbial abundance and the microbial community that's left over when the bugs have been grazing. And that ultimately is impacting this kind of CO2 arrow that I'm showing that's leaving the soil, which might not seem like a lot, but when you look at the numbers, and these are a little out of date, but they're still fairly, I updated them somewhat recently and they were still pretty on par. So the soils do store carbon, not as much as say the ocean, but it does store quite a bit. And the emissions are significant. They're not small. So understanding what controls those emissions and how the insects being in place alters them is something to consider. And if I haven't convinced you yet, I'm going to bring out the big guns, ants. And I'm going to tell you about a researcher named Ronald Dorn. So Ronald Dorn studies the amount of CO2 or carbon that rocks can absorb. And I don't fully understand the geology behind it, but I do know that these rocks are absorbing carbon. So when he would drill into the rocks to get samples, at certain sites, these ants would just come out and bite him all over his hands. And they were a nuisance, and they were awful. And then this happened for years and years. And finally, one day, he's thinking about these memorable times where these ants are biting him or stinging him, because it hurts. I've had it happen. It's not pleasant. So it's stuck in his memory. And he realized when he looked at the data that these areas had 330 times faster absorption of carbon than any of the other areas that he sampled. So ants have a massive role in how much carbon can be taken up by rock. And he doesn't know the exact, the last papers I read, he doesn't know the exact process, but it is happening, and he's working on patents, I think, related to making fences with like ants and rock. It sounds fascinating, but anyway, taking up carbon could be very impacted by ants. And then there's the bark beetles. So if you've ever looked at satellite data of vegetation in terms of bark beetles, you can see the impact that they have can be quite large. Their outbreaks can lead to high tree death. The dead trees are carbon. And then those dead trees can lead to forest fires as well as just getting broken down. And a recent paper found that insects cause 5 times more damage to, or more change to forest carbon cycling than all other biotic causes like viruses or fungi or things like that. So they have 5 times more impact than forest carbon. And insect pests are likely to get worse with warming. So insect activity can inform climate modeling. But climate models are also important for understanding insect activity. So in 2015, I was planning a trip to go to the Harry Potter area of Universal Studios with a good friend of mine. And she called me one day and she's like, I'm so sorry, I cannot go anymore. I'm trying to get pregnant. And I was like, okay, we need to back up, because what does that have to do with you not being able to go to Universal Studios? Well, this was the year of 2015. It was an El Nino year. And there were problems with mosquitoes, specifically mosquitoes that were carrying the Zika virus. And so she was very concerned about getting pregnant and then contracting Zika. But why is this all of a sudden a problem? We never thought about this in Florida. It has been a problem for a long time in other areas, but not in the US. That's because the mosquitoes' ranges are largely determined by temperature and also by moisture. But temperature plays a really large role in where they will be. So you're going to see these expanding ranges as the temperature continues to warm. And not only that, but their reproduction will become faster, and they will have longer seasons in which to reproduce because of warming. So predicting future insect abundance, distribution, ability to transmit disease, and more, including pollination, seed dispersal, all those great services they do for us, that depends on climate, and so climate models are really important to help us predict those future changes. And finally, this is just a fun little piece at the end. It's not satellites. It's actually something else to do with data. It's radar, because there's never a bad reason to look at mayflies on a radar. They're always so cool. This was just posted by my aunt like 2 days ago on Facebook, and she was like, oh, the mayflies are out. Fishing's going to be terrible. Because as you recall, fish like to eat terrestrial insects, although mayflies, you could argue, are more aquatic. So as a reminder, fisheries. One of the large impacts, terrestrial insects are a large food source for fish, and that can have cascading effects. In coastal areas, they affect nutrient cycling, which then affects algal blooms. We have mosquitoes in coastal areas that are going to be a problem with more flooding. With climate, you have expanding areas of pests, which are informed by climate modeling, but also you have ants and other invertebrates, which might affect CO2 cycling and uptake of CO2. So with that, I hope next time you have some salmon, you will thank a fly, and I can take any questions. Any questions in the room? Mm-hmm.
So, not related to what I do at NOAA, but as a personal interest and hobby, I'm very interested in bird populations. And it's clear that aerial insectivores, birds that feed on insects from the air,
right,
are in decline all over pretty much. And it's thought to be because of a large drop in the number of insects that are in the upper parts of the zone where life exists.
Right.
So I don't know if you've looked at that at all. You mentioned terrestrial, looking at an insects from a terrestrial versus an aquatic sort of benthic sort of origin, but there's a whole ecosystem up there that doesn't necessarily interact very much. It must somehow, but to what extent have you thought about that, and especially with climate? Are the insects up there being looked at? Because I've heard some studies that were mostly European, that there's been a dramatic decline in the number of insects in that zone. And I don't really know what the elevation is, but it's above the canopy of trees, and it's above where most people think of insects being.
Yeah. So the question was about aerial insects and how birds that feed on aerial insects are, I guess, how insect populations are changing and how that affects those birds. So I can't speak specifically to those particular insects, but I can say in general, there is a well-noted decline in insects. You can notice it yourself when you're driving down the expressway and you don't have to clean off your windshield like you used to. But those causes can be, they have such a variety. So climate is one of them, the species no longer being able to survive. They may have aquatic origins. A lot of insects, especially flies, actually start out their life in water. So there could be some aquatic reasons that that's happening. And then there's things like bees, for example, which I don't know that they'd be that high up, but pesticides are affecting bees. There's certain fungal parasites that are affecting bees. There's just piece after piece after piece that people have been researching about. So I'm not sure about the exact insects that would be up there, but there are so many issues that we've been running into with insect populations. Does that answer your question as much as I can, I guess?
Yeah, sure.
I really enjoyed the radar of the Mayflies. Did you see the very popular tweet that came out of the Southwest NWS
the
Center?
ladybugs?
Yeah, the ladybug bloom. And just piggybacking on the gentleman's comment about insects, they said those ladybugs were 4,000 to 8,000 feet or something like that. They were very high up.
Yeah.
Much higher up than I thought.
Yeah, and that honestly, yeah. Well, a lot of insects that move can get pretty high. So even to some degree, spiders can get really high. Oddly enough, because they'll like shoot some silk their behind, and the wind will grab it, and they just kind of flow on the currents. So.
Edward O. Wilson called them alien plankton.
Oh yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on the mayfly. I've always thought mayflies are a good indicator of lake health. But what's going to happen in Lake Erie with all the issues regarding them? How does that affect the mayfly population?
So he asked about mayfly populations and how they've been changing in Lake Erie. It's pretty variable year to year. The good news is it's actually been getting a little better. It's nothing compared to what it used to be. I mean, they used to have to bring out bulldozers. Or not bulldozers, other things. Snowplows. They have to bring out snowplows and plow up the mayfly. So it's nowhere near that level anymore, but some years it is still pretty high, and it's getting better, which is, fingers crossed, that will continue to happen, because they are really good indicators of Lake Erie health, which I try to tell people who are constantly upset about mayflies.
Yeah, even though they're a messy pest.
Right.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for now? Okay, we did have a shout out from someone online. They said, really interesting webinar. Thanks, Audrey. Go Ghostbuster those bugs.
Thank you.
So, all right, I guess we'll end it there for today. So thank you, Audrey.
Thank you.